A look at the life of King George and his countrymen. George III was 22 years old when he succeeded his grandfather as king in 1760. He was married to a German princess named Charlotte, and they would become the parents of 15 children. The king was absolutely devoted to his family. Their favorite home was a palace in the English countryside, surrounded by roses, pinks, carnations, and orange, lemon, and tea trees. But they spent most of their time in a smaller red brick mansion called Buckingham House, usually known as the Queen's House, in London, England, the capital of Great Britain, where the king worked. London, with its 740,000 inhabitants, was the biggest city in Europe and the center of British government. London's residents were proud of their long history and high level of cultural achievement. For fun, they went to masked balls and the theater, gambled at cards, dice, and roulette, belonged to all sorts of clubs, and met at coffee houses, taverns, chop houses, and pleasure gardens. Noisy streets teemed with horses, carriages, ballad singers, flower sellers, fishmongers, and ladies and gentlemen in fancy white wigs wearing all the latest fashions. But the overcrowded city had its share of problems, too. The death rate was high. All the coal that residents used as fuel caused black rain and thick, sooty smog. Food and drinking water were often unhealthy. Riots were common, and public hangings drew rowdy mobs. Thousands of beggars and pickpockets were evidence of poverty run amok. The English were convinced that the rest of the British Empire was backward and uncivilized. King George ruled 31 colonies and other possessions in many parts of the world, from Borneo to the Bay of Bengal and all the way to Honduras. Throughout England, people argued constantly about world politics, but they would soon argue especially hard about the uprising over in America. A look at the life of George Washington and his countrymen. George Washington was married to a wealthy widow named Martha Custis. Tiny, outgoing, and plump, Martha was a charming hostess. More than 2,000 guests visited their Mount Vernon home in the years before 1775. Martha had 2 young children from her previous marriage, and Washington adored them. The couple enlarged Mount Vernon into an enormous self-contained community. Washington grew tobacco, then switched to wheat. Besides raising mules, sheep, hogs, and prize bulls, he also bred horses and foxhounds, netted tons of fish, and grew such things as wild grapes, Indian corn, oats, clover, flax, hemp, and nut, apple, pear, apricot, and cherry trees. He even grew orange trees that spent the winter in his greenhouse. Gardeners, shoemakers, blacksmiths, weavers, foremen, and sometimes Washington's nieces and nephews all lived on the estate. Like all other plantation owners at the time, Washington was a slave owner. By 1775, he owned 135 people. About 90% of the colonists in America lived out in the country, where new arrivals from Europe were amazed to find farmland, forests, fish, and game as far as the eye could see. So much fertile territory made it possible to supply Great Britain with raw goods such as furs, flour, iron, tobacco, and lumber in return for manufactured goods, including cloth, shoes, furniture, and tea from Great Britain. In small but bustling port cities such as Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Charleston, whaling and shipbuilding were already major industries, and there were lumber mills, flour mills, factories, firehouses, and colleges. Streets, some paved, most full of mud or dust, overflowed with ox carts, horses and carriages, chimney sweeps, sailors, and carriers of wood. In local taverns, young girls danced lively jigs with their boyfriends. The most well-off, best-educated people were usually planters, like George Washington, merchants, doctors, ministers, or lawyers. Next came a very large middle class that included small farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, craftsmen, and fishermen. The poorest were unskilled laborers, indentured servants, and of course, black enslaved people from Africa who were bought, sold, and held in bondage in all 13 of the colonies. Many colonists wanted to settle the new territory they had helped to win during the 7 Years' War, but Great Britain made it illegal. London thought it was fairest and safest to reserve these lands for the Native Americans who had always lived and hunted there. George Washington agreed with plenty of other colonial settlers who thought the law unfairly limited their rights. They poured into the West anyway.